The story of human beings wrestling with the question of whether our lives are set on a predetermined track or whether we carve our own paths begins long before any formal philosophy was ever written down. It is a story that lives in the whispered prayers of ancient shrines, in the stone-carved tablets that recorded the names of the fates, and in the quiet reflections of early thinkers who first tried to turn myth into reason. In this segment, we will walk together through those earliest conceptions of destiny and agency, moving from the mythic figures who held the threads of life to the pre-Socratic minds that began to ask why in a language of natural explanation, and onward to the Stoic sages who taught that acceptance of the cosmic order does not erase personal responsibility. Along the way, we will hear the voices of the oracle at Delphi, feel the chill of a Norse winter where the Norns wove destiny, and listen to the skeptical doubts of Pyrrho, whose questions still echo in the corridors of contemporary debate. We will also glimpse how these ancient ideas resurfaced in medieval theology and early Islamic philosophy, reminding us that the tension between determinism and free will is a thread that runs through the whole tapestry of human thought. Imagine a time when the world was still young, when the sky was thought to be a dome of bronze, when thunder was the voice of a god, and when the very notion of cause and effect was wrapped in the language of divine will. In ancient Greece, the most vivid embodiment of destiny was the triad of the Moirai, the three sisters who spun, measured, and cut the thread of each human life. Clotho, the spinner, drew the thread from the loom of existence. Lachesis, the allotter, measured its length, determining how long a life would be, and Atropos, the unturnable, cut the thread, ending the story. Their names, the spinner, the allotter, the inflexible, reveal a worldview in which the ultimate shape of a life is not something we can alter, but something already inscribed in a cosmic fabric. The Greeks did not merely tell stories about these goddesses. They lived with the conviction that the Moirai were active forces, that the moment a child was born, its fate was already being measured by unseen hands. Travel northward and you encounter a similar, though culturally distinct, set of figures, the Norns of Norse myth. In the cold, mist-shrouded forests of Scandinavia, three women, Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld, stood beneath the world tree Yggdrasil, weaving the destinies of gods and men alike. Their names translate roughly to past, present, and future, suggesting a more temporal awareness than the Greek Moirai. Yet the essential idea remains: the course of life is bound to a tapestry that the divine weavers control. The sagas recount how even Odin, the All-Father, would consult the Norns, seeking counsel before embarking on his quests. In the poetic Edda, we hear the line, "All that is woven by the Norns," a reminder that in that world, causality was a matter of cosmic design rather than human agency. These mythic images served as the cultural backdrop against which the first philosophers began to ask, what is the nature of this order? Is it merely the will of capricious deities, or does it have a rational structure that we can understand? The pre-Socratic thinkers, emerging in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, were the first to turn away from mythic explanations and toward naturalistic accounts. They did not deny that the world seemed ordered, rather they sought to explain that order without invoking the whims of gods. Leucippus, a figure shrouded in historical obscurity, is traditionally credited with founding atomism. Though none of his writings survive, the fragments preserved by later philosophers tell us that he posited an infinite number of indivisible particles, atoms, moving through the void. In this view, the world is a vast, deterministic machine. Every motion, every collision, every arrangement of atoms follows from the immutable laws governing their motion. If every stone falls because of a natural law, and every fire burns because of the same kind of necessity, then what room is left for human freedom? The atomists seem to suggest that the same necessity that drives the falling of an apple also drives the choices we make. As Democritus, his most famous student, later put it, everything existing in the universe is the fruit of chance and necessity. Here we see the early articulation of a deterministic framework. Chance in the sense of random atomic motion, combined with necessity, the law-like regularities that follow from those motions. Democritus expanded this atomistic vision into a more comprehensive ethical system. He argued that the good life consists in understanding the natural order and aligning oneself with it. Yet, unlike the mythic fatalism of the Moirai, Democritus allowed for a kind of practical freedom. Knowledge could guide us to act in harmony with the deterministic flow, thereby achieving eudaimonia. He famously wrote, "The wise man is the one who can see the world as it is and act accordingly." In his view, the deterministic structure of the universe does not strip us of agency. It merely reframes it as the ability to understand the causal chain and to make choices that are in accord with it. While the atomists offered a materialist determinism, another strand of early Greek thought turned toward the concept of logos. Heraclitus, the ever-mysterious weeping philosopher, declared that everything flows, panta rei, and that the logos is common to all. For Heraclitus, logos was not merely a word, but the rational principle that underlies the perpetual change of the cosmos. He wrote, "Listening not to me but to the logos, you will understand the world." In this sense, logos functions as a universal law, a rational structure that orders the flux. If the world is governed by this rational principle, then causality is not random. It follows a discernible pattern that the wise can apprehend. Yet Heraclitus also recognized a tension. The world is in constant change, and human beings are often blind to the underlying order. He warned, "The sun is new each day." This paradox invites us to consider whether recognizing the logos grants us a form of freedom to act in accordance with the deeper rationality, rather than being swept away by superficial appearances. Parallel to Heraclitus, Plato, writing a generation later, introduced the notion of anank, often translated as necessity or force. In the Republic, he describes the soul's ascent from the world of appearances to the realm of the forms, guided by reason. Yet he also acknowledges that the material world is subject to anank, a binding force that shapes the course of events. In Book VII, he says, "There is a certain force that compels all things to be as they are, and this force we call anank." For Plato, anank is not a malevolent destiny but a necessary condition of the cosmos, a structural necessity that limits what can be otherwise. However, within the realm of the forms, especially the form of the good, there is a space for rational choice. The philosopher, through dialectic, can rise above the constraints of anank and grasp the timeless truths that are not bound by material necessity. Thus, Plato offers a dual picture: the world of becoming, bound by necessity, and the world of being, where the soul can exercise a higher kind of freedom through philosophical insight. The transition from mythic fatalism to early philosophical rationalism does not mean that ancient societies abandoned their stories about destiny. On the contrary, the mythic narratives continued to shape everyday decision-making. One of the most vivid examples is the Oracle of Delphi, the sacred site where the Pythia, the priestess of Apollo, delivered enigmatic pronouncements that were taken as divine guidance. The Greeks consulted the oracle on matters ranging from war to marriage, believing that the gods, through the oracle, revealed the inevitable course of events. A famous anecdote tells of the Athenian statesman Themistocles, who, before the Battle of Salamis, asked the oracle whether he should engage the Persian fleet. The response was cryptic: "If you fight, you will win." Themistocles interpreted this as a sign that victory was preordained, and he led his forces into battle, securing a decisive Greek triumph. Yet the very act of consulting the oracle reflects a belief that human agency operates within a framework of divine determinism. One seeks confirmation that one's intended action aligns with the fated outcome. The oracle's pronouncements often employed double meanings, leaving room for interpretation, and thereby allowing individuals to feel both guided and responsible. Another concrete example of ancient causal thinking can be found in the legal and social structures of the Roman Republic, which, though later than the Greek period, inherited many of the same ideas about destiny and causality. Roman jurists often invoked the principle of fatum, fate, when discussing the inevitability of certain outcomes, yet they simultaneously upheld a robust concept of voluntas, will, in the realm of law. A citizen who broke a contract could be held liable because his will had acted contrary to the natural order of agreements, a belief that the law itself reflected a cosmic order. This duality illustrates how societies could acknowledge deterministic forces while still assigning moral responsibility. The Stoics, emerging in the Hellenistic period, took the deterministic insights of earlier thinkers and wove them into a comprehensive ethical system. Epictetus, a former slave turned philosopher, taught that some things are within our control and some are not. He famously said, "It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them." In the Stoic view, the universe is a rational, providential organism, governed by logos, the divine reason that permeates all. Everything that happens is part of the cosmic plan, a necessary unfolding of the logos. Yet for the Stoic, freedom lies not in changing external events since they are predetermined, but in aligning our internal judgments with the rational order. This internal alignment is what the Stoics called apatheia, a state of tranquility achieved by accepting the necessity of events while maintaining moral agency. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who also penned the Meditations, reflected this stance in his daily reflections. He wrote, "The universe is change, our life is what our thoughts make it." He urged himself to see each obstacle as an opportunity to practice virtue, to respond in accordance with reason rather than emotion. In practice, the Stoics employed a technique called premeditatio malorum, or the premeditation of evils. They would imagine the worst possible outcomes, a loss of loved ones, a sudden illness, a political defeat, so that when such events occurred, they would not be surprised or overwhelmed. This exercise demonstrates a profound understanding of deterministic causality. By anticipating that misfortune is inevitable, the Stoic prepares the mind to meet it with equanimity, thereby exercising a form of inner freedom. The anecdote of the emperor in the midst of a brutal war on the Danube frontier, pausing to write in his journal, "Do not be ashamed of your desire for a quiet life," shows how even those at the apex of power grappled with the tension between external determinism and internal agency. Yet not all early thinkers accepted this deterministic picture uncritically. The skeptic Pyrrho of Elais, who lived in the 4th century BCE, is often considered the founder of Pyrrhonian skepticism. While his writings have not survived, the accounts of later philosophers, especially Sextus Empiricus, reveal a radical doubt about the possibility of certain knowledge. Pyrrho is said to have concluded that because we cannot ascertain the true nature of causality, whether events are caused by necessity, chance, or the will of the gods, we should suspend judgment and live according to appearances. He is reported to have declared, "Neither the things themselves nor the things that are said about them exist." This profound suspension of belief can be read as a counter-argument to deterministic claims. If we cannot know the underlying causal structure, then any assertion of determinism is on shaky ground. Pyrrho's skepticism invites us to consider whether the very notion of a fixed causal chain is itself a mental construct, one that may not reflect the reality of the world. The early skeptics did not merely deny that we could know the causal order, they also challenged the moral implications of determinism. If every action is the inevitable result of prior causes, can we justly hold someone responsible for wrongdoing? The skeptic's answer in the Pyrrhonian tradition is to withhold judgment, not to deny responsibility outright, but to recognize the limits of our epistemic reach. This stance would later influence the development of moral philosophy, where the question of responsibility under determinism becomes a central concern. From these early debates, the ideas of fatalism and determinism traveled forward, taking on new shapes in the medieval period. In Christian theology, the doctrine of divine providence articulated a form of fatalism that was compatible with the belief in a benevolent, omniscient God. Augustine of Hippo famously wrote, "God foreknows all things, yet this foreknowledge does not compel the will." The medieval scholastics grappled with reconciling God's omniscience with human free will, leading to nuanced positions such as middle knowledge, Molinism, and double predestination. The tension mirrors the ancient Greek tension between the Morai's unchangeable threads and the Stoic call for internal freedom. In the Islamic Golden Age, the philosopher Al-Ghazali, also known as Al-Ghazali, engaged deeply with the deterministic implications of Aristotelian causality and the Sufi emphasis on divine will. In his seminal work, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, he argued that the universe is ultimately governed by God's will, and that the apparent causal chains we observe are merely manifestations of divine decree. Yet he also emphasized the importance of intention, niyya, and moral responsibility. He wrote, "The human being is responsible for his deeds because the Creator has given him the capacity to choose." Al-Ghazali's synthesis reflects a medieval form of fatalism that does not erase agency, but situates it within a larger, divinely ordered framework, much like the Stoic view that individual virtue is a microcosm of cosmic rationality. When we consider the ancient mythic figures, the early philosophical arguments, the Stoic practices, and the skeptical challenges, a pattern emerges. The human mind has always been caught between two poles: the desire to see the world as a coherent, law-governed system, and the yearning to feel that we are authors of our own stories. The Mora and the Norns embody the former, weaving a tapestry that seems immutable. The pre-Socratic atomists and Heraclitus articulate a rational order that can be studied, perhaps even mastered. The Stoics accept the deterministic cosmos but propose a path to inner freedom through acceptance and rational alignment. The skeptics, from Pyrrho to later Hellenistic thinkers, remind us that certainty may be elusive, urging humility in the face of cosmic complexity. Let us pause for a moment and reflect on the practical implications of these ancient ideas in our modern lives. Consider the modern scientific understanding of genetics. When a child is born with a particular set of genes, we know that those genes heavily influence traits such as height, susceptibility to certain diseases, and even aspects of temperament. This deterministic view of biology echoes the atomist's belief that the smallest building blocks dictate larger outcomes. Yet, just as the Stoics taught that we can respond virtuously to whatever nature gives us, contemporary ethicists argue that knowledge of genetic predispositions does not absolve individuals of moral responsibility. A person may have a genetic inclination toward aggression, but society still holds them accountable for violent actions because the capacity for choice remains, a modern echo of the ancient debate. Another modern illustration can be found in the realm of economics. The law of supply and demand, a principle that governs market behavior, can be seen as a contemporary expression of logos, a rational structure underlying the flow of goods and services. When a sudden shortage of a resource occurs, prices rise and consumers adjust their behavior accordingly. The deterministic nature of market forces is undeniable. Yet individuals and policymakers still make choices that can mitigate or exacerbate economic crises. The decision of a central bank to raise interest rates, for instance, reflects an exercise of agency within a deterministic framework, much like the Stoic practice of premeditatio malorum, where one anticipates adverse conditions and prepares a measured response. The ancient practice of premeditatio malorum also finds a counterpart in modern cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. In CBT, patients are encouraged to anticipate potential negative thoughts and to rehearse adaptive responses. This therapeutic technique mirrors the Stoic exercise of visualizing misfortune so that when it arrives, one is not caught off guard. Both practices recognize that while external events may be beyond our control, our internal reactions are within our power. The continuity across millennia underscores how the ancient philosophical insights remain relevant, offering tools for navigating a world that is at once deterministic in its laws and open to human agency. Returning to the mythic world, we might ask, what would the Moirai say about the modern scientist who discovers a causal chain linking climate change to human activity? In the ancient narrative, the Moirai would have spun the thread of humanity's fate, perhaps measuring a finite lifespan for the planet. Yet the modern individual armed with knowledge can act to alter the course of that thread through policy, technology, and collective will. This tension mirrors the Stoic belief that while we cannot change the external logos, we can align our inner disposition to act virtuously within it. The ancient myth thus becomes a metaphor for contemporary responsibility. The threads are woven, but the pattern can be reshaped by conscious effort. The historical anecdotes we have explored also illuminate how ancient societies internalized these ideas. The Oracle of Delphi, for instance, was not merely a mystical institution. It functioned as a social mechanism that allowed individuals to externalize their anxieties about fate and to receive a sanctioned endorsement of their intended actions. When the city-state of Sparta consulted the oracle before the Battle of Thermopylae, the response, "Your fate is sealed, but your glory will be remembered," provided both a deterministic affirmation and a motivational boost. The Spartans marched into battle, aware that their destiny was foretold, yet still choosing to act bravely. In this way, the oracle's pronouncements reinforced a belief in destiny while simultaneously empowering decisive action, a duality that resonates with the Stoic acceptance of external necessity paired with internal resolve. The Stoic practice of premeditatio malorum, as we noted, involved mentally rehearsing potential hardships. A famous story recounts how the Stoic philosopher Seneca, before embarking on a sea voyage, imagined his ship being wrecked, his wealth lost, his family perishing. By confronting these possibilities in his mind, he claimed to have reduced his fear when, in reality, the voyage proceeded without disaster. This anecdote illustrates how the Stoics turned deterministic expectations, recognizing that misfortune is inevitable, into a tool for cultivating resilience. It also demonstrates a practical method of integrating philosophical insight into everyday life, a lesson that modern readers can apply in contexts ranging from personal health challenges to professional setbacks. The counter-argument from early skeptics, embodied by Pyrrho, invites us to consider the limits of our knowledge. If the ancient atomists claimed that every motion follows immutable laws, and the Stoics asserted that the cosmos is a rational, providential order, then the skeptic asks, how do we know? Pyrrho's radical suspension of judgment can be unsettling, but it also serves as a reminder that certainty is a fragile construct. In contemporary philosophy, this skepticism finds echo in the debates over scientific determinism versus quantum indeterminacy. While classical physics suggested a clockwork universe, quantum mechanics introduced probabilistic elements that challenge strict determinism. The ancient dialogue between determinism and skepticism thus continues, now enriched by empirical discoveries that blur the line between necessity and chance. Cross-referencing these ancient ideas with later philosophical developments deepens our understanding. The medieval fatalism of Augustine, for instance, can be seen as an extension of the deterministic worldview of the Stoics, yet filtered through a theological lens that emphasizes divine love. Augustine wrote, "God is the author of all things, yet he does not force the will of man." This paradox mirrors the Stoic claim that external events are beyond our control, but internal assent is within our power. Similarly, Al-Ghazali's synthesis of divine will and human responsibility reflects a continuity with the ancient Greek concern for reconciling cosmic order with moral agency. Al-Ghazali argued that while God's decree determines the unfolding of events, human beings are still accountable because they possess the faculty of intention, a notion reminiscent of the Stoic emphasis on inner judgment. Even the modern existentialists, such as Sartre, can be traced back to this ancient lineage. Sartre famously declared that existence precedes essence, asserting that humans are not bound by any predetermined nature and must create their own values. This radical freedom stands in stark contrast to the deterministic threads of the Moirai, yet it also resonates with the Stoic call to shape one's inner life, regardless of external circumstances. The dialogue between determinism and freedom, therefore, is not a linear progression, but a complex web of ideas that loop back on themselves across cultures and epochs. As we contemplate these ancient narratives, it becomes clear that the question of determinism versus free will is not merely an abstract philosophical puzzle. It is a lived experience, reflected in the way societies construct law, in the way individuals make choices under pressure, and in the way cultures tell stories about destiny. The Moirai and the Norns remind us that the human imagination has always reached for a personified explanation of causality. The pre-Socratic atomists and Heraclitus show us the early attempts to replace myth with rational principles. The Stoics demonstrate a path to inner freedom within a deterministic cosmos, while the skeptics caution us against overconfidence in our claims. The medieval and Islamic thinkers illustrate how these debates were reinterpreted in the light of religious doctrines, preserving the tension while reshaping its contours. In the end, perhaps the most profound lesson from this historical journey is that the interplay between determinism and free will is itself a dynamic process, a kind of intellectual logos that evolves as humanity's understanding of the world deepens. The ancient myths provided a framework for making sense of unpredictable events. The early philosophers offered tools for systematic inquiry. The Stoics gave us practices for cultivating resilience. The skeptics taught us humility. And the later theological traditions integrated these insights into broader moral narratives. Each of these contributions adds a thread to the tapestry of thought, a tapestry that, unlike the immutable thread of Atropos, remains open to reinterpretation and reweaving. So as you sit here listening, perhaps you can hear the faint echo of the oracle's voice, the rustle of the Norn's loom, the quiet breath of the atomist's void, and the steady pulse of the Stoic's heart. In that chorus, you might find a space to contemplate your own place within the grand pattern of causality. Are you a thread already measured, or are you the spinner, measuring your own length? The ancient philosophers would say that the answer lies not in the external world, but in how you choose to perceive it. By recognizing the deterministic currents that shape our lives, while also nurturing the capacity to respond with reasoned intention, we honor both the ancient wisdom of fate and the timeless human yearning for freedom. In this delicate balance, the story of determinism and free will continues, ever unfolding, ever inviting us to engage with the deepest questions of what it means to be a conscious, responsible agent in a universe that is both ordered and mysterious. The story of classical determinism begins not with a single flash of insight, but with a slow, relentless unfolding of the scientific imagination that took shape in the 17th and 18th centuries. Imagine the night sky, the steady march of the planets, the predictable fall of an apple. These observations whispered a promise, that the universe might be governed by immutable laws, that if we could learn those laws, we could, in principle, predict every future event. This promise was the seed from which the mechanistic worldview grew, and it was nurtured by a handful of thinkers whose names still echo through the corridors of philosophy and physics. When we speak of Newton, we are not merely recalling a name on a marble plaque, but invoking a vision of the world as a great clockwork. In his Principia Mathematica, Isaac Newton articulated 3 laws of motion that described how bodies move under forces, and a universal law of gravitation that linked the motion of a falling stone to the orbit of the moon. Newton wrote, "The motions of the heavens are governed by the same principles which govern the motions of the earth." In a calm, reflective tone, we can hear the certainty in his words. If we know the initial position and velocity of a particle, and we know the forces acting upon it, we can calculate its future trajectory with perfect precision. The universe for Newton was a deterministic machine, each cog turning according to a law that could be expressed in mathematical symbols. But Newton's brilliance was only the opening act. The French mathematician Pierre-Simon Laplace took the Newtonian clockwork and imagined an intelligence that could read every detail of the present. In his 1814 A Philosophical Essay on Probabilities, Laplace famously described what later scholars would call Laplace's demon. He wrote, "We may regard the present state of the universe as the effect of its past and the cause of its future." An intelligence which at a given instant knew all forces that set nature in motion, and all positions of all items of which nature is composed. If this intelligence were also vast enough to submit these data to analysis, it would embrace in a single formula the movements of the greatest bodies of the universe and those of the tiniest atom. In a calm, measured voice, we can sense the awe in this claim. That the future is not a mystery at all, but a hidden extension of the present, awaiting only the right computational power to be revealed. Laplace's demon is not a literal being, of course. It is a thought experiment that pushes deterministic reasoning to its logical extreme. It asks us to consider a universe where probability is merely a reflection of our ignorance, not an ontological feature of reality. In this view, randomness is a placeholder for "I do not know the precise conditions," and the true nature of the world is entirely fixed. The deterministic narrative that emerges from Newton and Laplace is often called scientific determinism, and it became a cornerstone of Enlightenment thought. It offered a comforting certainty that the chaotic swirl of daily life could, in principle, be reduced to equations, that human affairs could be understood as the sum of causal chains, just like the motion of a planet. Thomas Hobbes, though better known for his political philosophy, contributed a crucial link between physics and human freedom. In Leviathan 1651, Hobbes famously declared, "The notion of liberty or free will is to be taken in a very particular sense, which is the power of doing whatever one wills if one does not have any impediment of external bodies." For Hobbes, the same deterministic laws that govern the motion of the stars also govern the motions of human bodies and minds. He argued that our thoughts, desires, and choices are the results of the motion of particles in the brain, set in motion by prior causes. In a calm, reflective cadence, we can see how Hobbes extended the mechanistic metaphor from the heavens to the human soul, suggesting that even moral responsibility might be reframed as a pattern of causal events. The deterministic narrative, however, did not go unchallenged. One of its earliest and most elegant counter-arguments came from Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, a contemporary of Newton who championed a very different metaphysical picture. Leibniz introduced the principle of pre-established harmony, a notion that the universe is composed of an infinite number of simple substances, monads, each reflecting the entire cosmos from its own perspective. He wrote, "Each monad by its own internal principle acts in perfect accord with every other, as though a divine conductor had arranged the music before the performance began." In this view, the apparent causal connections we observe are not true interactions between independent substances, but rather a synchronized unfolding of a divine plan. The deterministic chain of cause and effect is thus replaced by a harmonious correspondence that does not require one event to push another forward in time. Leibniz's harmony offers a subtle way to preserve freedom. If each monad follows its internal principle, then the will can be seen as an expression of that inner drive, not merely a downstream effect of external forces. Immanuel Kant, writing at the turn of the 19th century, offered a different kind of critique. In the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant introduced the distinction between the phenomenal world, the world as it appears to us, structured by our senses and categories, and the noumenal world, the thing in itself, which remains forever beyond direct cognition. He argued we cannot know the thing in itself, we can only know the appearances that conform to the conditions of our sensibility. For Kant, the deterministic laws of Newton apply to the phenomenal realm, the world of appearances that our minds can order mathematically. Yet the noumenal realm, which includes the freedom of the will, lies outside the scope of empirical science. In a calm, measured tone, we might ask, if the universe we can describe is deterministic, does that leave any room for genuine agency? Kant would answer that freedom is a postulate of practical reason, a necessary assumption for moral responsibility, rather than a claim about the empirical world. Thus, Kant preserves a kind of dualism. The world of natural law is deterministic, while the realm of moral action remains free. These philosophical tensions did not remain confined to abstract treatises, they spilled into lively, sometimes heated, public debates. One anecdote that illuminates the cultural reach of Laplace's ideas involves his correspondence with Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1799, after Napoleon's rise to power, he asked Laplace whether the future of France could be predicted by the laws of nature. Laplace replied with characteristic modesty, "I have no need of that hypothesis." He was essentially saying that the deterministic model, while powerful, did not grant him the authority to foretell political outcomes. The exchange, preserved in letters, reveals how the deterministic worldview was both admired and questioned by the very architects of history. Napoleon, a man of ambition and strategic calculation, found the deterministic claim both fascinating and unsettling, because it suggested that even the grand designs of empire might be subject to impersonal forces. Another vivid episode took place in the year 1848, a year of revolutions across Europe, when the Austrian physicist Ernst Mach and the German psychologist Wilhelm Wundt engaged in a public debate about causality. Mach, a staunch empiricist, argued that scientific laws are merely economical descriptions of regularities, and that we should suspend judgment about any underlying real causes beyond what can be observed. He famously said, "Science is the art of ordering our experiences, not of discovering an ultimate reality." Wundt, on the other hand, defended the idea that mental phenomena have genuine causal structures that could be investigated scientifically, insisting that psychology needed its own methodological foundations. Their debate, recorded in contemporary journals, highlighted a growing split between a purely descriptive, deterministic physics and a burgeoning discipline that sought to account for the complexity of human experience. It also foreshadowed later discussions about whether causality itself might be an emergent, rather than fundamental, feature of the world. The deterministic picture painted by Newton, Laplace, and Hobbes found its most powerful expression in the language of mathematics. The equations of motion, the calculus of variations, the law of universal gravitation, all these tools gave scientists a sense that the universe could be reduced to a set of solvable problems. Yet as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, cracks began to appear in this grand edifice. The advent of thermodynamics introduced the concept of entropy, suggesting that while microstates evolve deterministically, macroscopic phenomena exhibit an arrow of time that seems to resist reversal. Later, the development of quantum mechanics would reveal a domain where probability is not merely a reflection of ignorance, but a fundamental feature of reality. In a calm, reflective tone, we can ask, does quantum indeterminacy overturn Laplace's demon, or does it merely push the limits of predictability further out? Contemporary discussions about chaos theory bring a fresh perspective to the age-old debate. Chaos theory shows that even deterministic systems can behave in ways that are practically unpredictable. The classic example of the double pendulum, two rods hinged together, demonstrates how tiny variations in initial conditions can lead to wildly divergent trajectories. This sensitivity to initial conditions, famously described by Edward Lawrence in his study of weather patterns, is often summarized by the metaphor of the butterfly effect. A butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil might set off a chain of events that leads to a tornado in Texas. The equations governing the system are deterministic; they do not contain any random elements. Yet the outcomes become effectively random for any observer who cannot measure the initial state with infinite precision. In this sense, the deterministic universe of Laplace is constrained not by a lack of laws, but by the practical limits of knowledge and measurement. The implications of chaos theory resonate with the historical anecdotes we have considered. Imagine Laplace's demon, equipped with a perfect knowledge of every particle's position and momentum, attempting to predict the weather. In principle, the demon could calculate the exact future state of the atmosphere. In practice, however, the slightest error, perhaps a dust particle displaced by a gust, would cascade into a dramatically different forecast. The deterministic framework remains intact, but its predictive power becomes bounded by the precision of our data. This modern insight invites us to revisit the philosophical critiques of Leibniz and Kant. Leibniz's pre-established harmony can be reinterpreted as a metaphor for the hidden order that underlies chaotic behavior. The universe may be deterministic, yet its surface appears disordered, much like a symphony whose notes are arranged in a complex but harmonious pattern. Kant's distinction between phenomena and noumena gains new relevance when we consider that the noumenal, if we take it to mean the ultimate, exact state of the world, might forever elude us, not because it is fundamentally unknowable, but because our instruments and cognitive capacities are limited. To bring these ideas into everyday life, consider two concrete examples. First, think about the motion of a satellite orbiting Earth. Engineers calculate its trajectory using Newtonian mechanics, taking into account gravitational forces, atmospheric drag, and the satellite's mass. The calculations are deterministic, and the satellite follows the predicted path, unless an unexpected event, such as a micrometeoroid impact, alters its momentum. Even then, the impact itself can be described by deterministic physics. The uncertainty lies in our inability to predict such rare events. Second, consider the field of epidemiology. During an outbreak, scientists model the spread of disease using differential equations that assume each infected individual transmits the pathogen to a certain number of others. The model is deterministic, yet real-world outcomes often deviate because of stochastic factors, variations in human behavior, mutations in the pathogen, or random super-spreader events. Here, the deterministic framework provides a useful baseline, while acknowledging that probability and chance play indispensable roles in the final picture. These examples illustrate a broader point. Deterministic models are indispensable tools, but they are always embedded in a context where measurement error, incomplete information, and emergent complexity introduce a layer of unpredictability. This duality is echoed in the words of Albert Einstein, who, despite his famous deterministic leanings, admitted, "God does not play dice." Yet he also recognized the limits of classical determinism when he later wrote, "The distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion." Einstein's ambivalence captures the tension that has animated philosophers from Newton's era to the present day. Returning to the historical figures, we can trace a line of intellectual inheritance that connects Newton's clockwork universe to modern discussions of free will. Hobbes, with his materialist view of the mind, laid the groundwork for later neuroscientists who argue that decisions emerge from neural circuitry obeying physical laws. Leibniz, with his monadic harmony, anticipates contemporary ideas about emergent properties, where higher-level phenomena, like consciousness, are not reducible to simple particle interactions, yet are fully consistent with underlying physical laws. Kant's moral philosophy, insisting on the necessity of freedom for ethical responsibility, finds a modern echo in compatibilist theories that reconcile deterministic neuroscience with the lived experience of choice. The debate between Ernst Mach and Wilhelm I also foreshadows a split that persists today between reductionist and holistic approaches. Mach's insistence that science should describe regularities without committing to metaphysical claims resonates with the modern instrumentalist stance in philosophy of science. One's push for a psychology grounded in its own methods anticipates the interdisciplinary fields of cognitive science and neurophilosophy, which seek to bridge the gap between deterministic brain processes and subjective experience. Their 1848 exchange, set against the backdrop of revolutionary Europe, reminds us that scientific ideas are never isolated from the social and political currents of their time. In the 21st century, the conversation has expanded to include computational complexity and information theory. The question, can a computer simulate the universe, is a modern incarnation of Laplace's demon. If the universe is deterministic, then in principle, a sufficiently powerful computer could calculate every future state. Yet the field of computational complexity tells us that some problems are intractable. They require more time or resources than the universe itself possesses. This insight adds a new layer to the deterministic narrative. Even if the laws are fixed, the resources needed to predict the future may exceed what is physically possible. As the philosopher David Deutsch has argued, the limits of computation are themselves subject to the laws of physics, suggesting a deep intertwining of determinism, predictability, and the structure of reality. Chaos theory, quantum mechanics, and computational limits together paint a nuanced picture. Determinism remains a powerful explanatory framework for many domains, planetary motion, engineering, chemistry, yet it coexists with genuine indeterminacy at other scales and with practical unpredictability that arises from complexity. The philosophical stakes are profound. If our actions are ultimately the product of deterministic chains, what does that mean for moral responsibility? If, as Kant suggested, the noumenal realm preserves a space for freedom, does that space have any causal efficacy, or is it merely a regulative idea that guides our ethical deliberations? Leibniz's harmony invites us to see the universe as a grand, pre-arranged composition, where each individual note, each decision, contributes to a larger, coherent whole, even if we cannot perceive the full score. One way to navigate these tensions is through the concept of compatibilism, the view that free will and determinism are not mutually exclusive. Compatibilists argue that freedom can be understood as the ability to act according to one's desires and rational deliberations, even if those desires have deterministic origins. In this light, Hobbes's materialism can be reconciled with a meaningful notion of agency. Our choices are the outcomes of internal processes that, while caused, are still our processes. The calm, reflective tone of this argument invites us to consider that freedom may be a matter of degree, not an all-or-nothing proposition. Another contemporary perspective comes from the field of emergentism, which builds on Leibniz's intuition. Emergentists claim that at higher levels of organization, such as societies, ecosystems, or minds, new causal powers arise that are not reducible to the sum of their parts. These emergent properties can influence the behavior of lower-level components, creating a feedback loop that blurs the simple one-directional chain of cause and effect envisioned by early determinists. For instance, cultural norms can shape individual behavior, which in turn alters the cultural landscape, a dynamic that cannot be fully captured by a straight line of deterministic causation. The historical anecdotes we have revisited also remind us that determinism has always been a living, contested idea, shaped by the intellectual climate of its age. Laplace's correspondence with Napoleon illustrates how deterministic optimism could be tempered by political reality. Mach's debate with Wundt shows that even within the scientific community, the very notion of causality was under scrutiny. These episodes serve as a reminder that philosophical concepts are not static doctrines, but evolving conversations, responsive to new discoveries and societal shifts. As we draw this segment to a close, let us pause and reflect on the central question that has animated centuries of thought. Is the universe a grand, clockwork mechanism whose future is fully encoded in its present, or is there room for genuine novelty, spontaneity, and freedom? Newton's equations whisper a confident yes, Laplace's demon declares a bold indeed, while Leibniz's harmony hums a subtle perhaps, and Kant's critique gently reminds us of the limits of our knowledge. The modern insights of chaos theory, quantum indeterminacy, and computational complexity add further nuance, suggesting that predictability is bounded not only by the laws themselves, but by the very architecture of information and measurement. In the end, the dialogue between determinism and free will is not a battle to be won, but a conversation to be deepened. It invites us to examine the foundations of science, the structures of language, and the contours of moral experience. It challenges us to ask with calm curiosity whether the future is a pre-written script or an unfolding story in which each of us, as both actors and authors, contributes a line. The answer may lie somewhere in the interstice between the deterministic gears of the cosmos and the emergent, meaningful patterns of human life, a place where the precision of Newtonian physics meets the poetry of human freedom, and where the echo of Laplace's demon meets the whisper of Kant's moral law. The story of free will, as it unfolds across the centuries, is not a tidy line drawn from one great mind to the next, but rather a winding river that gathers tributaries of doubt, conviction, and the restless yearning of human beings to see themselves as agents of their own destiny. To begin at the source, we must listen to the voice of Augustine of Hippo, a man whose inner turmoil over the nature of the will would echo through the corridors of Western thought for more than 1,000 years. Augustine, writing in the early 5th century, found himself torn between the seductive certainty of divine grace and the unsettling awareness of his own sinful inclinations. In his Confessions he confesses, "I have made the will the instrument of my sin, I have turned away from the divine law." He describes a night-long wrestling with the question. If God created the world with perfect order, how could a creature so bound to that order still be held responsible for choosing evil? Augustine's answer, forged in the crucible of personal experience, was to locate true freedom not in the raw capacity to will any action, but in the capacity to will the good, to align the will with the divine will. Yet even as he elevated the will toward the good, he could not escape the paradox that the very act of willing the good seemed to presuppose a freedom that was itself uncaused. This internal conflict, the tension between a will that is both a source of sin and a potential conduit of grace, became the cornerstone of what later philosophers would call libertarian free will, a freedom that is not merely the absence of external compulsion, but the presence of an indeterminate, self-originating choice. When we move forward 1,000 years to the 17th century, the intellectual climate has shifted dramatically. The scientific revolution has begun to pry open the mechanisms of nature, and with it the question of whether the human mind is another clockwork mechanism subject to the same laws as falling apples. René Descartes, ever the architect of a new epistemology, offers a striking response in his Meditations. He begins with the famous cogito, "I think, therefore I am." For Descartes, the act of thinking is itself proof of an indubitable existence, a self-evident fact that cannot be doubted. Yet he does not stop there. He proceeds to argue that the will, the faculty that says "I will," is distinct from the intellect that perceives ideas. In the second meditation he writes, "The will is as free as the mind itself. It can affirm or deny, pursue or avoid without any necessity. This liberty of the will," he claims, "is the very essence of what makes us human, Descartes envisions the will as an unbounded power, capable of choosing even against the dictates of reason. In his view, the freedom to will is not merely the freedom to act without external restraint, but the freedom to choose ideas that are not compelled by the chain of cause and effect that governs the physical world. The Cartesian free agent, then, stands as a counterpoint to the deterministic clockwork of the universe, a soul that can assert its own direction even as the body obeys the laws of physics. From Descartes, we leap to the existential crisis of the 20th century, where the question of freedom is no longer a metaphysical abstraction, but a lived experience in a world scarred by war, alienation, and the collapse of grand narratives. Jean-Paul Sartre, in his seminal work Being and Nothingness, pronounces a bold, almost defiant claim: existence precedes essence. In the quiet of his prose, Sartre insists that there is no pre-given human nature that determines what we must become. Rather, we first find ourselves thrown into the world naked and bewildered, and then we must fashion our own essence through the choices we make. He writes, "Man is condemned to be free." Because once thrown into the world, he is responsible for everything he does. For Sartre, freedom is the ultimate burden. It is not a freedom that is simply permitted by the absence of constraints, but a freedom that is constitutive of our being. To act is to affirm our existence, to define ourselves in the face of an indifferent universe. Sartre's radical liberty is a direct descendant of Augustine's yearning for a will aligned with the good, and of Descartes' affirmation of an unbounded will, yet it pushes the idea further. There is no divine law, no metaphysical order, no external essence to appeal to. The individual alone must bear the weight of creating meaning, and in doing so must accept full moral responsibility for each act. It is in the realm of law and psychology that these lofty philosophical claims find concrete expression, reminding us that the stakes of the free will debate are not confined to the ivory towers of academia. Consider the legal notion of mens rea, the Latin term for guilty mind. In criminal law, a defendant is not merely judged by the external act, the actus reus, but also by the mental state that accompanied it. The law asks, did the person intend, know, or recklessly disregard the consequences of their action? If the answer is affirmative, the individual is deemed morally responsible, and the justice system imposes punishment. This legal framework rests on the assumption that the person possessed the capacity to choose otherwise, that the will was not wholly determined by external forces. The very structure of criminal accountability is a practical affirmation of libertarian free will. Without the possibility of a different choice, the notion of blame would evaporate, and with it the foundation of our moral and legal order. A second, more recent illustration comes from the field of neuroscience, from the experiments of Benjamin Libet in the early 1980s. Libet measured the brain's readiness potential, a slow buildup of electrical activity that precedes a voluntary motor act, while participants reported the moment they felt the conscious intention to move. Libet found that the readiness potential began roughly half a second before the participants became aware of their intention. He famously concluded that the brain initiates the action before we become conscious of our decision. Yet, in a surprising twist, Libet also observed that participants could exert a veto power, a conscious ability to stop the action after the readiness potential had already begun. He called this the free will window, a brief interval in which the conscious self could intervene. The implication of Libet's work is complex. It seems to undermine a naive notion of free will, suggesting that our decisions are initiated unconsciously, while simultaneously preserving a form of agency through the capacity to inhibit or endorse the action. The experiment forces us to reconsider the timing and locus of freedom, but it does not dissolve the moral significance of choice. Even if the neural spark originates beneath awareness, the conscious self still plays a decisive role in allowing or aborting the movement, preserving a space for responsibility. These examples, legal responsibility and neural timing, are not isolated curiosities. They are the living battlegrounds where the philosophical arguments for and against free will are tested. To understand the full picture, we must now turn to the counterarguments that challenge the libertarian position. David Hume, an 18th-century Scottish philosopher, offers a nuanced compatibilist perspective that seeks to reconcile freedom with determinism. Hume writes, by liberty we can mean a power of acting according to the determinations of the will, and by necessity, that same will is determined by the prior causes of the universe. For Hume, the apparent conflict between free will and determinism dissolves when we recognize that freedom is simply the ability to act according to one's desires, without external coercion. The will may be determined by prior causes, genes, upbringing, environment, but as long as the individual's actions flow from their own internal motivations, they are free in the relevant moral sense. Hume's compatibilism reframes the debate. It is not the metaphysical origin of the will that matters, but the alignment of action with personal desire. In this view, the legal concept of mens rea is perfectly compatible with a deterministic universe, because the law cares about whether the act matches the person's internal state, not about the ultimate source of that state. Opposing Hume's middle ground stands the hard determinist stance of Baruch Spinoza, a 17th-century rationalist whose monistic metaphysics leaves little room for libertarian freedom. Spinoza famously declares, "The more we understand the necessity of things, the more we are at peace." For Spinoza, everything that exists follows from the one substance, God or nature, according to immutable laws. Human thoughts and actions are modes of this substance, and therefore necessarily determined. The illusion of free will, he argues, arises from our ignorance of the causes that shape us. When we recognize that our choices are the inevitable outcomes of prior conditions, we can achieve a kind of serenity, accepting our place within the deterministic chain. Spinoza's view challenges the very notion of moral responsibility. If every action is predetermined, can we truly hold anyone accountable? Yet Spinoza does not deny the practical usefulness of moral judgments. He suggests that such judgments are part of the natural order that guides us toward greater understanding and well-being, even if they do not reflect ultimate metaphysical freedom. The historical record offers vivid anecdotes that illustrate how societies have wrestled with these ideas, often at the cost of human lives. In the 17th century, during the height of witchcraft persecutions, a woman named Alcina of Wittenberg, though her name varies in the surviving records, was brought before a magistrate accused of exercising her will against divine order. The accusation was not simply that she performed a forbidden ritual, but that she had consciously chosen to defy the providential plan laid out by God. The court's indictment read in stark language that her will, unbound by the Almighty's decree, has turned to sorcery, endangering the souls of the faithful. The trial culminated in a public execution, a grim reminder that the claim to a free, autonomous will could be weaponized to justify the harshest punishments when it threatened the prevailing theological order. The case underscores how the notion of free will, when framed as rebellion against a divine hierarchy, can become a catalyst for social control and violence. A more recent, hopeful anecdote emerges from the civil rights movement of the 1960s, a period when the claim to agency was reclaimed as a source of collective empowerment. In 1963, during the March on Washington, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech, concluding with a powerful appeal to the moral agency of a nation. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. King's rhetoric framed the struggle for civil rights not as a deterministic unfolding of history, but as a conscious, deliberate act of will by millions of individuals who chose to resist oppression. The movement's success hinged on the belief that people could, through collective action, alter the social structures that seemed immutable. This historical moment demonstrates how the conviction in human agency can inspire profound social transformation, reinforcing the libertarian claim that individuals are capable of initiating real change, even in the face of entrenched systemic forces. To navigate between these extremes, libertarian freedom and hard determinism, contemporary philosophers have sought more nuanced positions. Harry Frankfurt, in his famous essay on alternate possibilities, argues that moral responsibility does not require the ability to have done otherwise. He introduces the idea of Frankfurt cases, scenarios in which a person makes a choice that aligns with their desires, even though a hidden mechanism would have compelled them to make the same choice had they wavered. Frankfurt writes, a person can be morally responsible for an action even if they could not have done otherwise. This view preserves the intuitive sense that we hold people accountable, while acknowledging that the underlying determinants may limit the range of options. Similarly, Daniel Dennett, a leading defender of compatibilism, reframes freedom as a matter of the capacity to act according to reasons. In his book Freedom Evolves, Dennett suggests that what matters is not metaphysical indeterminacy, but the degree to which an organism can reflect upon its motivations, adjust its behavior, and integrate information from its environment. He likens human agency to a sophisticated software system that can rewrite its own code within certain constraints. Both Frankfurt and Dennett offer a middle path that respects the insights of neuroscience, law, and moral intuition, while avoiding the paradoxes of absolute libertarian freedom. The conversation does not stop within the Western tradition. Buddhist philosophy, especially as articulated in the Mahayana and the Theravada schools, presents a distinctive perspective on agency that both resonates with and challenges the libertarian narrative. The Buddha taught that the mind is a process, not a static entity, and that suffering arises from attachment to the illusion of a permanent self. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha declares, "All that we are is the result of what we have thought." This emphasizes the causal chain of mental formations, suggesting that what we call choice is conditioned by prior volitional formations, siddhas. Yet Buddhism also affirms the possibility of cultivating wholesome mental states through mindfulness and ethical practice, thereby gradually increasing the freedom to act in ways that reduce suffering. The concept of upaya, skillful means, reflects an understanding that agency can be expanded through disciplined training, even while acknowledging that each moment arises dependent on countless conditions. In this way, Buddhist thought offers a nuanced view. Freedom is not an uncaused metaphysical spark, but a cultivated capacity to navigate the flow of causes with wisdom, thereby exercising a form of agency that is both responsibly grounded and liberating. Returning to Augustine, we see that his early struggle over the will laid a foundation that would echo in these later developments. Augustine's notion of the will as a battleground between sin and grace anticipates the existential tension that Sartre would later dramatize, albeit without the theological overlay. Augustine's confession that the will is a restless desire for the infinite captures the human yearning for a freedom that transcends mere physical determinism. Descartes, building on this, isolates the will as a distinct faculty capable of affirming or denying ideas independent of the intellect, thereby granting a metaphysical space for free choice. Sartre, in his radical existentialism, removes the divine anchor and insists that the will is the sole source of meaning, an unbounded freedom that is both a gift and a curse. Yet each of these thinkers also acknowledges limits: Augustine's reliance on divine grace, Descartes' occasional concession that the will can err when it oversteps reason, Sartre's recognition that freedom can lead to anguish and bad faith. These constraints remind us that the story of free will is not a simple proclamation of unbounded autonomy, but a continual negotiation between possibility and limitation. The legal example of mens rea illustrates how this negotiation operates in practice. In a murder case, the prosecution must establish that the defendant possessed a guilty mind, that they either intended to kill, knew that death was a probable result, or acted with reckless disregard. If a defendant's brain were shown, through neuroimaging, to have a deterministic pattern that precludes any alternative choice, the law would face a profound dilemma. Should the state still impose punishment? The modern legal system, however, maintains a pragmatic stance, treating the question of mental causation as secondary to the observable fact that the individual acted in a way that aligns with societal norms of responsibility. This pragmatic approach mirrors the compatibilist view that moral accountability hinges on the alignment of action with internal states, regardless of ultimate causation. Libet's experiments, meanwhile, invite us to reconsider the temporal structure of agency. If the brain initiates an action before conscious awareness, does the self that we think of as the decision-maker merely become a spectator? Yet the existence of the veto window suggests that consciousness still exerts a veto power, a final say that can halt the pre-conscious impulse. This aligns with Sartre's claim that we are condemned to be free, in that we must constantly confront the possibility that we can either affirm or deny the impulse that arises within us. It also resonates with Frankfurt's insight that the capacity to act according to reasons, whether or not we could have done otherwise, underpins moral responsibility. The readiness potential thus becomes a neural metaphor for the philosophical tension between determinism and freedom, a pre-conscious drive that can be overridden by reflective self-control. When we examine the hard determinist perspective of Spinoza, we see a stark contrast. Spinoza would argue that the readiness potential is just another manifestation of the necessary unfolding of nature's laws, and that the feeling of having vetoed an action is an illusion born of ignorance. Yet even Spinoza acknowledges that understanding the necessity of our actions can lead to peace. In modern terms, this could be likened to the therapeutic practice of acceptance and commitment therapy, which encourages individuals to recognize the deterministic influences on their thoughts while still committing to value-driven actions. Thus, Spinoza's deterministic peace finds a contemporary echo in psychological approaches that blend acceptance of causality with purposeful agency. The witchcraft trial of the 17th century illustrates the darker side of asserting a free will that stands against divine order. The accused woman, whose name has been lost to history, was condemned not for any concrete crime, but for the perceived audacity of exercising an independent will that threatened the theological hierarchy. The court's language framed her as a willful rebel against God's providence, and the execution served as a public warning that the claim to autonomy could be punished when it challenged the prevailing power structures. This anecdote reminds us that the philosophical debate is never purely abstract. It is entangled with social, political, and religious forces that can weaponize the concept of freedom. In contrast, the civil rights movement of the 1960s demonstrates how the affirmation of agency can become a transformative social force. The activists, many of whom were imprisoned, faced legal systems designed to suppress dissent, yet they persisted, invoking a belief in the moral agency to reshape law. Dr. King's speeches and the collective action of the Freedom Riders embodied Sartre's existential claim that we are our choices, while also reflecting the Buddhist notion that through disciplined practice, nonviolent protest, strategic planning, individuals can expand their capacity to act in ways that reduce collective suffering. The movement's success underscores that the belief in free will can be a catalyst for societal change, even when structural forces appear deterministic. Cross-referencing these historical moments with contemporary thought, we find that Harry Frankfurt's source-hood concept dovetails with the moral agency celebrated by civil rights leaders. Frankfurt argues that what matters for responsibility is not the abstract ability to have done otherwise, but the presence of a source of volition, a set of desires that are authentically one's own. The activist's commitment to nonviolence, rooted in deeply held convictions, exemplifies this source-hood. Similarly, Daniel Dennett's evolutionary account of freedom, as the capacity to anticipate future states and act accordingly, resonates with the strategic planning that underpinned the civil rights campaigns. Dennett's view that freedom is an emergent property of complex information processing finds a concrete parallel in the way organizers used data, communication networks, and collective memory to coordinate actions that would have been impossible for isolated individuals. The Buddhist perspective adds another layer, suggesting that agency can be cultivated through mindfulness and ethical discipline. In the practice of right action, samma kammanta, one learns to observe the conditions that give rise to impulses, thereby gaining the capacity to respond rather than react. This process mirrors the veto observed in Libet's experiments. The conscious mind, trained through meditation, can inhibit the automatic readiness potential and choose a different course. In this sense, Buddhist training offers a practical method for expanding the window of conscious control, aligning with the existential claim that freedom is exercised in the moment of decision. The dialogue between these various thinkers, Augustine, Descartes, Sartre, Hume, Spinoza, Frankfurt, Dennett, and Buddhist scholars, creates a rich tapestry in which the question of free will is refracted through multiple lenses. Augustine's theological framing introduces the idea that freedom is tied to moral goodness, while Descartes separates the will from the intellect, granting it a metaphysical autonomy. Sartre pushes further, stripping away any external anchor and placing the burden of meaning entirely on the individual. Hume and Frankfurt, in their compatibilist moves, argue that moral responsibility survives even if the will is causally determined, focusing on the internal alignment of desire and action. Spinoza, in stark contrast, dissolves the illusion of freedom altogether, urging acceptance of necessity. Dennett, meanwhile, offers an evolutionary narrative that sees freedom as an adaptive capacity emerging from complex cognition. Buddhist philosophy weaves through all of this, reminding us that agency is both conditioned and cultivable, a process rather than a static property. When we consider real-world applications, the stakes become vivid. In criminal justice reform, debates over the relevance of neuroscience to culpability echo the tension between libertarian and compatibilist positions. If future technologies could reliably predict a person's propensity for violent behavior, would society be justified in preemptively restricting that individual's freedom? Proponents of a hard determinist view might argue that such interventions are merely acknowledging the causal chain that leads to crime, while libertarians would warn that preemptive punishment erodes the moral space necessary for genuine choice. The legal principle of mens rea, however, persists because it assumes that individuals can be held accountable for the quality of their intentions, even if those intentions have deterministic origins. This pragmatic stance reflects a compatibilist compromise. We maintain moral responsibility for the sake of social order, while recognizing that the ultimate causes of behavior may lie beyond conscious control. In the sphere of personal development, the interplay between determinism and freedom informs therapeutic approaches. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, operates on the premise that while thoughts and feelings may be conditioned by past experiences, individuals possess the capacity to reframe and choose new patterns of response. This aligns with Sartre's claim that existence precedes essence, we can rewrite our essence through deliberate choices, even if those choices are influenced by prior conditions. Similarly, mindfulness-based interventions draw from Buddhist practice, teaching that by observing the arising of impulses without immediate reaction, we can expand the space for conscious choice, effectively lengthening the veto window that Libet described. Both therapeutic models illustrate how the philosophical debate about free will translates into concrete strategies for enhancing human agency. The historical anecdotes we have examined also serve as cautionary tales about how societies deploy the language of freedom. The witchcraft trials demonstrate that the claim to autonomous will can be turned into an accusation of rebellion, justifying persecution. The civil rights movement, conversely, shows how the assertion of agency can empower oppressed peoples to demand justice. These contrasting outcomes remind us that the philosophical concept of free will is never neutral. It is always embedded within power structures that can either suppress or amplify human agency. In the contemporary academic landscape, the dialogue continues with philosophers like Robert Kane, who defends a form of libertarianism called event-causal free will, arguing that indeterministic events at the quantum level can provide genuine openings for free choice. Kane writes, if the brain is a complex system that can amplify quantum fluctuations, then the ultimate source of a decision can be indeterminate, preserving the authenticity of the will. Critics, however, point out that randomness does not equate to control, and that a decision driven by chance may not be any more free than one determined by prior causes. This debate illustrates the ongoing attempt to reconcile scientific findings with the intuition that we are agents capable of initiating actions. Meanwhile, contemporary Buddhist scholars such as Thich Nhat Hanh emphasize the interdependence of self and environment, proposing a middle path that acknowledges conditioned arising while cultivating mindful awareness to act skillfully. He often says, when we understand that our thoughts arise because of causes, we can still choose to respond with compassion. This perspective dovetails with Frankfurt's notion of sourcehood. The source of our actions can be a cultivated set of values and intentions, even if the raw material of those values is conditioned. In sum, the rise of free will as a cornerstone of moral responsibility and the liberal tradition is a story of persistent tension between the desire to affirm human agency and the recognition of the forces that shape us. Augustine's anguished confession, Descartes' bold declaration of an unbound will, Sartre's existential proclamation, Hume's pragmatic compatibilism, Spinoza's deterministic peace, Frankfurt's nuanced sourcehood, Dennett's evolutionary account, and Buddhist teachings on conditioned mind, all converge to form a multifaceted dialogue that continues to shape law, psychology, politics, and everyday life. The legal notion of mens rea reminds us that societies still operate on the presumption of agency, while Libet's experiments challenge us to refine our understanding of where consciousness intervenes in the causal chain. Historical episodes, from witchcraft trials to civil rights protests, illustrate how the claim to free will can be wielded both as a tool of oppression and as a catalyst for liberation. Contemporary debates about quantum indeterminacy, neuroethics, and therapeutic practices show that the question is far from settled, and that each new discovery invites us to revisit the ancient paradox. Are we the authors of our own stories, or merely characters moving along a script written by forces beyond our sight? As we reflect on this rich tapestry, perhaps the most honest answer lies not in choosing one side over the other, but in recognizing that freedom, responsibility, and determinism are interwoven strands of the same human experience. The liberty we cherish may be bounded, the determinism we observe may be incomplete, and the agency we exercise may be both a product of conditioning and a cultivated skill. In the quiet moments of contemplation, when we pause to consider the weight of our choices, we participate in the very tradition that Augustine, Descartes, and Sartre began, a tradition that invites us to wrestle with the paradox, to hold the tension, and to keep moving forward, ever aware that our freedom, however limited, is the very ground upon which we build meaning, justice, and compassion. The question that has haunted philosophers for millennia, whether we are the ultimate authors of our actions or merely the products of forces beyond our control, has never been more urgent than it is today. In the 21st century, the clash between determinism and free will is no longer confined to the abstract corridors of metaphysics. It reverberates through the laboratories of neuroscience, the algorithms of artificial intelligence, and the very legal systems that hold us accountable. In this segment, we will wander through the contemporary landscape of that age-old dispute, pausing to hear the voices of the leading thinkers, to examine the arguments that sharpen the debate, and to glimpse the ways in which science both illuminates and muddies the picture. We will meet compatibilists who claim that freedom can coexist with determinism, incompatibilists who argue that the two are fundamentally at odds, whether in the libertarian sense that insists on genuine alternative possibilities, or in the hard determinist sense that denies any such room. We will also explore the emergent perspectives that arise from the newest findings in neuroscience and from the strange, probabilistic world of quantum mechanics. Along the way, we will hear the consequence argument of Peter van Inwagen, the manipulation argument of William Gibbard, and the counter-stories offered by Daniel Dennett, Harry Frankfurt, Galen Strawson, and Robert Kane. We will see how brain-reading technologies and quantum indeterminacy become concrete arenas where these abstract ideas are tested. And we will travel back to two pivotal moments in recent history: the 1999 debate between John Searle and Daniel Wegner on consciousness, and the 2010 Free Will Symposium at the Institute for Advanced Study, both of which shape the way philosophers and scientists speak about agency today. Throughout, we will cross-reference related concepts such as moral luck, the principle of alternative possibilities, and even the Chinese room thought experiment, to show how the web of ideas stretches far beyond any single discipline. Let us begin calmly and reflectively with a brief sketch of the three main camps that dominate contemporary discourse. Compatibilism, often labeled soft determinism, holds that the truth of determinism does not, by itself, preclude moral responsibility. The classic formulation can be traced to David Hume, but the most influential contemporary voice belongs to Daniel Dennett. Dennett argues that what matters for freedom is not the metaphysical status of the universe, but the functional capacities of the agent. In his book Freedom Evolves, he writes, "The kind of freedom that matters is the ability to act according to one's reasons, to revise one's plans, to be responsive to the future." For Dennett, the brain is an evolved prediction machine, constantly generating models of possible futures and updating them on the basis of new information. The capacity to forecast and to re-evaluate is what grounds a meaningful notion of freedom, even if the underlying processes are deterministic. In a calm voice, Dennett invites us to imagine a river whose course is set by the terrain, yet whose waters can be redirected by a well-placed dam. The dam does not change the fact that the water flows downstream. It changes the path the water takes, and that change is what we call agency. Harry Frankfurt, another prominent compatibilist, offers a different angle. In his seminal paper Alternate Possibilities and Moral Responsibility, Frankfurt famously claims that the principle of alternative possibilities, the idea that a person is morally responsible only if they could have done otherwise, is unnecessary. He presents thought experiments involving counterfactual intervener devices that would have forced a different choice, yet the agent still acts on their own reasons. Frankfurt writes, "What matters is not that the agent could have done otherwise, but that the agent acted on reasons that are his own." This shift from could have to owns the reasons reframes the debate. Responsibility rests on the internal source of the action, not on the metaphysical openness of the future. Frankfurt's view resonates with our everyday experience of taking credit for a decision that feels authentic, even if, in a deterministic sense, the decision was inevitable. On the opposite side of the spectrum sit the incompatibilists, who maintain that determinism and free will cannot both be true. Within incompatibilism, we find two major strands. Libertarians, such as Robert Kane, argue that genuine free will requires the ability to choose otherwise, what philosophers call alternative possibilities. Kane's self-formative model emphasizes the role of ultimate responsibility, insisting that agents must be the ultimate source of their actions, even in the face of indeterministic events. He famously writes, "The indeterminacy that matters for freedom is not the microscopic randomness of particles, but the indeterminacy that emerges in the moments of decision-making, where the agent's self-forming process can tip the scales." For Kane, the brain is not a deterministic machine, but a decision-making arena, where higher-order processes can harness indeterminacy to produce a genuinely open future. Hard determinists, by contrast, deny the existence of any such freedom. Galen Strawson, a leading contemporary defender of hard determinism, argues that the intuition that we could have done otherwise is illusory. In his essay The Impossibility of Moral Responsibility, Strawson claims, if determinism is true, then every action is the inevitable result of prior states of the world, and there is no room for the agent to be the originator of any action. For Strawson, the feeling that we could have acted otherwise is a psychological illusion born of our limited perspective on the causal chain. He goes further, suggesting that the very notion of moral responsibility is a social construct that, while perhaps useful, does not reflect the underlying metaphysics. These three positions, compatibilism, libertarian incompatibilism, and hard determinist incompatibilism, are not merely academic curiosities. They shape how we interpret the newest scientific data and they inform the policies we craft around emerging technologies. To see this, let us turn to the first modern example, the debate over brain-reading technologies. Imagine a future in which a non-invasive neuroimaging device can decode a person's intention seconds before the person becomes consciously aware of it. In 2022, a team at the University of California reported that functional magnetic resonance imaging combined with machine learning could predict a subject's choice between two buttons with 80% accuracy, up to 3 seconds before the subject reported the decision. This finding resurrected the classic Libet experiments, where Benjamin Libet famously observed a readiness potential preceding conscious will. The contemporary twist, however, is that the predictive power is now strong enough to be considered for practical applications. Think of lie detection, criminal investigations, or even market research. The question becomes, if a machine can read our intentions before we are aware of them, does that mean we are not free? Compatibilists like Dennett would argue that the predictive capacity of the brain does not undermine freedom. The brain's ability to forecast its own actions is precisely the mechanism that underwrites the kind of reason-guided behavior Dennett celebrates. The device is simply reading a process that the agent is already using to evaluate options. Dennett might say the fact that the brain can be modeled does not mean the model is deterministic in the philosophical sense. It merely shows that the brain operates according to computational principles that can be anticipated. In this view, the readiness potential is not a hidden puppet master, but a transparent stage where the agent's reasons are already being weighed. Libertarians, however, would seize on the same data as evidence that our choices are not as free as we think. If a machine can reliably predict a decision before we are conscious of it, perhaps the decision is already fixed and the feeling of agency is a post hoc rationalization. Robert Kane would point to the self-formative moments that might be overridden by such predictive technology. He might ask, if an external system can intervene based on its prediction, does the agent still retain ultimate responsibility? For libertarians, the existence of a reliable brain-reading device threatens the very possibility of alternative possibilities because it suggests that the future is already determined enough to be read. Hard determinists would see the brain-reading results as confirming their thesis. Strawson would argue that the predictive success simply demonstrates that our actions are the inevitable consequences of prior neural states and that our sense of freedom is a comforting illusion. He might add, when we discover that our mental life can be mapped with such precision, the illusion of free will becomes increasingly untenable. The second modern example brings us to quantum mechanics, a field that has long been invoked in free will debates. The indeterminacy at the heart of quantum theory, embodied in Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and the probabilistic nature of wave function collapse, offers a potential loophole for libertarians who seek genuine openness in the universe. Some philosophers, following the ideas of physicist Niels Bohr and later of philosopher David Albert, argue that quantum randomness could provide the genuine indeterminacy needed for free will. They suggest that if the brain's microprocesses are influenced by quantum events, then at certain decision points the outcome is not predetermined. However, critics quickly point out that randomness alone does not equate to freedom. Robert Kane acknowledges this, noting that mere randomness is not sufficient for agency. We need a kind of controlled indeterminacy that is still owned by the agent. The challenge, then, is to explain how quantum indeterminacy could be harnessed in a way that preserves personal responsibility. One proposal, known as the quantum mind hypothesis, suggests that the brain's neural assemblies might operate near a critical point where quantum fluctuations can tip the balance between competing neural pathways. In such a scenario, the agent's self-forming process could be the very thing that selects among quantum-generated possibilities, thereby integrating indeterminacy without surrendering control. Compatibilists often dismiss the quantum appeal as unnecessary. Dennett writes, even if the universe is fundamentally indeterministic, the fact that some events are probabilistic does not add anything to the story of agency. What matters is the capacity to act on reasons. For him, the quantum world is a background detail that does not affect the functional architecture of decision-making. He likens it to the weather. The exact positions of air molecules are indeterminate, yet we can still plan a picnic based on reliable forecasts. Similarly, an agent can plan and act based on reasons, irrespective of the microscopic randomness underlying neural firing. Hard determinists, on the other hand, may argue that quantum indeterminacy is insufficient to rescue free will because it merely introduces randomness, not agency. Strawson would say, if my decision hinges on a quantum fluctuation, then I am no more responsible for the outcome than I am for the roll of a dice. The the randomness, far from granting freedom, merely replaces deterministic necessity with stochastic chance, leaving the question of moral responsibility untouched. The interplay between these philosophical positions and scientific findings is further sharpened by two classic counter-arguments that have been refined in recent decades: the consequence argument and the manipulation argument. Peter van Inwagen's consequence argument is a cornerstone of incompatibilist reasoning. In its simplest form, the argument proceeds as follows: if determinism is true, then every event, including our actions, is the consequence of the laws of nature and events that occurred before our birth. Since we have no control over those prior events or the laws themselves, we have no control over the consequences, and therefore we lack free will. Van Inwagen famously concludes, if determinism is true, then we have no freedom of action. This argument forces compatibilists to respond not only to the abstract notion of determinism, but also to the intuition that we cannot be the ultimate source of our actions if they are the inevitable outcomes of a causal chain that stretches back beyond us. Compatibilists answer by challenging the premise that no control over the past entails no control over the present. Dennett, for instance, distinguishes between origination and responsibility. He suggests that we can be responsible for actions that are caused by our own reasons, even if those reasons themselves have deterministic origins. In a calm, reflective voice, Dennett might say, "The fact that my reasons are caused does not diminish the fact that they are mine." Frankfurt's counterexample also serves to undercut the consequence argument. Even if all the conditions leading up to a decision are fixed, the agent can still be said to act freely if they act on their own reasons, uncoerced by any external manipulator. The manipulation argument, articulated by William Gibbard, offers a different angle. Gibbard asks us to imagine a scenario in which an agent's decision is reliably manipulated by a hidden device that reads the agent's preferences and then subtly nudges the choice. If the agent's action is the result of such manipulation, we would say the agent is not truly free, even though the agent's internal mental states might appear normal. Gibbard's point is that freedom requires not just the absence of external coercion, but also the absence of covert manipulation that bypasses the agent's rational deliberation. This argument resonates strongly with contemporary concerns about algorithmic influence and neuromarketing. If a corporation can use brain-reading technology to predict and then subtly shape consumer choices, are those consumers exercising free will? Compatibilists might reply that as long as the manipulation does not override the agent's reasons, responsibility remains intact. Libertarians would argue that any such covert influence erodes the space of alternative possibilities, thereby violating the core requirement for free agency. Hard determinists would see this as further evidence that our sense of autonomy is a veneer over a deterministic process that can be hijacked by external forces. To see how these abstract debates play out in real scholarly exchange, let us revisit two pivotal historical moments that have become touchstones for contemporary discussions. In 1999, the philosopher John Searle and the cognitive psychologist Daniel Wegner faced off in a televised debate at the University of California, Berkeley. Searle, famous for his Chinese room thought experiment, defended the view that consciousness, and by extension, free will, requires a kind of subjective, first-person perspective that cannot be reduced to purely physical processes. He argued that any attempt to explain consciousness in purely mechanistic terms inevitably leaves out the qualia that give agency its felt reality. Wegner, on the other hand, presented a series of experiments on illusion of conscious will, showing that people often experience a sense of agency even when their actions are triggered by external cues they are unaware of. He famously demonstrated that participants would report feeling they caused a tone that was actually played automatically in response to a hidden sensor. The debate crystallized a key divide: whether the phenomenological experience of willing is sufficient for moral responsibility, or whether it is merely an epiphenomenal narrative constructed after the fact. The Searle-Wegner exchange continues to be cited whenever neuroscientists claim that free will is an illusion, and it underscores the tension between first-person experience and third-person explanation, a tension that both compatibilists and incompatibilists must navigate. A decade later, in 2010, the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton hosted a symposium titled Free Will: Philosophical, Scientific, and Legal Perspectives. The gathering brought together philosophers such as Daniel Dennett, Robert Kane, and Galen Strawson, alongside neuroscientists like Sam Harris and legal scholars concerned with culpability. The symposium produced a series of papers that highlighted the interdisciplinary nature of the debate. One of the most striking contributions came from Dennett, who argued that the legal system already operates on a compatibilist framework, holding people responsible for actions that are the result of their reasons, regardless of underlying determinism. In contrast, Kant presented a robust defense of libertarian free will, insisting that the law should evolve to recognize ultimate responsibility only if we can establish that agents have genuine alternative possibilities. Strawson, meanwhile, warned that the legal system may be built on a moral fiction that could be undermined by future scientific discoveries. The symposium's proceedings emphasized that the philosophical stakes are not isolated academic curiosities. They have concrete implications for how societies punish, rehabilitate, and understand human behavior. These historical anchors remind us that the contemporary debate is not static. As new empirical findings emerge, philosophers must continually reassess the foundations of their arguments. The interplay between the principle of alternative possibilities, PAP, and moral luck, for instance, illustrates how nuanced the discussion can become. Moral luck, a term popularized by Thomas Nagel and Bernard Williams, refers to the observation that factors beyond our control, such as the circumstances of our birth or the outcomes of our actions, affect moral judgment. If we accept PAP, then an agent must have had the ability to do otherwise for moral responsibility to hold. Yet if moral luck can influence the very conditions that make alternative possibilities possible, the line between responsibility and chance blurs. Frankfurt's critique of PAP shows that perhaps we do not need the ability to have done otherwise, but rather the ownership of reasons. Compatibilists leverage this to argue that moral luck does not undermine responsibility, while libertarians claim that moral luck reveals the fragility of any claim to free agency. The Chinese room thought experiment, originally designed by Searle to challenge strong artificial intelligence, also offers a useful analogy for the free will debate. Imagine a person locked inside a room who follows a set of syntactic rules to manipulate Chinese symbols, producing responses indistinguishable from those of a native speaker. From the outside, it appears that the room understands Chinese, yet Searle insists that there is no genuine understanding, only rule following. In the context of free will, the brain could be likened to the Chinese room. A complex system that manipulates inputs and outputs according to deterministic rules, producing the illusion of agency without any real freedom. Compatibilists might argue that the illusion is sufficient for responsibility, just as the Chinese room's outputs are sufficient for communication. Libertarians, however, would claim that without genuine understanding, or in the free will case, without genuine alternative possibilities, the system lacks the essential ingredient of agency. The analogy helps us see why the debate hinges not merely on causal description, but on the normative question of what we require for moral accountability. Let us now return to the scientific frontiers that have sharpened these philosophical lines. Neuroscience, especially the study of volition, has produced a wealth of data that both supports and challenges each camp. In 2008, a study by Sun et al. Used functional MRI to predict participants' choices up to 10 seconds before conscious awareness, achieving accuracies significantly above chance. The authors concluded that the neural antecedents of free choices are detectable well before the experience of intention. For hard determinists like Strawson, this is a striking confirmation that the feeling of volition is a post hoc narrative. For compatibilists, the same data can be interpreted as the brain's predictive machinery, an essential component of rational deliberation, rather than a refutation of agency. For libertarians, the results raise the unsettling possibility that the brain's decision is already made before the self becomes aware, thereby eroding the space for genuine choice. Quantum mechanics offers a different kind of challenge. The phenomenon of quantum entanglement, wherein particles exhibit correlated behavior instantaneously across distance, suggests a level of interconnectedness that defies classical causal chains. Some philosophers, like Tim Maudlin, have argued that such non-locality could provide a metaphysical opening for free will, allowing agents to be causally efficacious in a way that is not bound by deterministic trajectories. Others, like Adrian Miller, caution that quantum effects at the neuronal level are likely to be washed out by thermal noise, rendering them irrelevant for macroscopic decision-making. The debate remains unsettled, but it illustrates how even the most exotic corners of physics are drawn into the conversation about agency. In practice, the stakes of these abstract arguments become palpable when we consider legal and ethical policies. Suppose a court is faced with a defendant whose brain scan shows a pattern that predicts violent behavior with high reliability. If we adopt a hard determinist stance, we might argue that the defendant could not have acted otherwise, and thus traditional notions of punishment lose their justificatory force. A compatibilist approach would maintain that, even if the behavior was predictable, the defendant still acted on reasons that can be evaluated. Perhaps the brain pattern reflects a predisposition, but the decision to act violently still involved a deliberative process. A libertarian might insist that the legal system must incorporate safeguards to preserve genuine alternative possibilities, perhaps by ensuring that interventions do not preempt the agent's self-forming decision. These divergent policy implications underscore why the philosophical nuances matter beyond the ivory tower. Let us also consider the role of moral luck in this context. Imagine two individuals, both with identical neural predispositions toward aggression, but one lives in a society with strong social support, while the other is isolated. The former never acts violently. The latter commits a crime. If we accept that moral luck influences outcomes, then the responsibility we attribute to the second individual may be partially a product of circumstances beyond their control. Compatibilists might respond by focusing on the agent's reasons and the social context as part of the causal network that shapes decisions, thereby preserving responsibility while acknowledging luck. Libertarians would stress that the second individual's inability to have done otherwise, due to overwhelming external pressures, undermines the claim of ultimate responsibility. Hard determinists would simply note that both individuals are part of a deterministic chain, and the moral judgments we make are themselves determined by cultural and psychological factors. Returning to the manipulation argument, contemporary concerns about algorithmic nudging provide a vivid illustration. Companies now employ dark patterns, design choices that steer users toward particular actions without their explicit awareness. A user may click agree to a privacy policy because the button is highlighted, not because they have deliberated. Gibbard would argue that such manipulation compromises the authenticity of the user's choice. Compatibilists might counter that if the user's underlying preferences align with the outcome, the manipulation does not invalidate responsibility. Libertarians would likely see any covert influence as a violation of alternative possibilities, insisting that true freedom requires the capacity to detect and reject such nudges. Strawson would observe that the manipulation simply reveals how our decisions are the inevitable result of prior conditions, in this case, the design of the interface, further confirming the deterministic picture. The dialogue between these positions is enriched by cross-references to other philosophical ideas. The principle of alternative possibilities, PAP, serves as a litmus test for many arguments. Frankfurt's counterexamples suggest that PAP is not necessary for moral responsibility. Yet libertarians cling to PAP as a non-negotiable condition. The debate over PAP also intersects with discussions of sourcehood, the idea that an agent must be the source of their actions. Some contemporary philosophers, like John Martin Fisher, argue for semi-compatibilism, maintaining that moral responsibility can be preserved without committing to a full compatibilist account of free will. Fisher's view draws on the concept of guidance control, where an agent's capacities for rational self-governance are central. This notion dovetails with Dennett's emphasis on reason-guided action, while also resonating with Frankfurt's focus on ownership of reasons. Another thread we have not yet explored in depth is the relationship between free will and the concept of moral luck. As mentioned earlier, moral luck raises the puzzle of how factors beyond our control can affect moral assessment. If we accept that moral luck exists, does it erode the case for libertarian free will? Some libertarians, like Robert Kane, argue that moral luck does not threaten ultimate responsibility because the agent's self-forming process can incorporate the very contingencies that constitute luck. In other words, the agent's capacity to shape their character in response to luck is itself a form of freedom. Compatibilists, meanwhile, can accommodate moral luck by treating it as part of the causal network that informs an agent's reasons. Hard determinists might simply claim that moral luck is a natural consequence of a deterministic universe, and that our moral judgments are themselves shaped by luck. To bring these abstract threads together, let us consider a concrete, everyday scenario that we can all relate to. Imagine you are standing at a crossroads, literally and metaphorically, deciding whether to take a new job in a different city. Your brain is processing a myriad of factors: salary, family ties, personal ambition, the weather forecast. According to Dennett's compatibilist model, your decision emerges from a complex predictive simulation your brain runs, weighing the reasons you value. Even if the underlying neural processes are deterministic, the fact that you can articulate, revise, and endorse your reasons makes the choice an expression of freedom. Frankfurt would add that as long as you act on reasons that you own, perhaps you value being close to your aging parents, your responsibility does not depend on whether you could have chosen otherwise. A libertarian like Kane would press further, asking whether there was a genuine moment where you could have done otherwise, perhaps by embracing a different value set, and whether that moment was not merely the result of deterministic or random processes. If a neurotechnology were to read your brain and predict that you will accept the job with 90% confidence, the manipulation argument would caution that such prediction could influence your decision, perhaps nudging you toward the predicted outcome, thereby compromising the authenticity of your choice. A hard determinist would simply note that the entire deliberation is the inevitable unfolding of prior states, and that the feeling of agency is a narrative you construct after the fact. Now let us imagine a more extreme case, one that brings quantum indeterminacy into focus. Suppose a future quantum-enhanced brain-computer interface can amplify the effect of quantum fluctuations on neuronal firing, creating a quantum lever that the agent can consciously engage at decision points. In theory, this could provide the libertarian with a source of controlled indeterminacy, allowing the agent to choose among quantum-generated possibilities. However, as Kane acknowledges, the challenge is to ensure that the agent's self-formative process, not random chance, determines which quantum outcome is actualized. If the quantum lever simply adds noise, the decision remains unanchored. If instead the agent learns to harness the quantum lever through reflective practice, then perhaps the agent's ultimate responsibility is restored. Compatibilists would likely view the quantum lever as an irrelevant detail, emphasizing that the agent's reasons remain the decisive factor. Hard determinists would argue that even quantum events are governed by the way functions deterministic evolution according to the Schrödinger equation, and that any apparent randomness is just an epistemic limitation. These speculative possibilities illustrate how the philosophical debate continuously adapts to scientific innovation. The interplay between the consequence argument and the manipulation argument, for instance, shows that both the metaphysical chain of causation and the practical ability to intervene matter. Van Inwagen's consequence argument forces us to confront the idea that if our actions are the inevitable result of prior conditions, we lack the power to be truly responsible. Gibbard's manipulation argument reminds us that even if we could, in principle, be the ultimate source of our actions, covert external influences can undermine the authenticity of our choices. Together, they create a two-pronged challenge that any comprehensive theory of free will must address. The 1999 Cyril Wegner debate and the 2010 IAS Symposium serve as landmarks that remind us how philosophical discourse evolves. In the Cyril Wegner encounter, the clash between a first-person, phenomenological defense of free will and a third-person, experimental demonstration of illusory agency set the stage for later debates about the role of consciousness in moral responsibility. The 2010 Symposium, by bringing together philosophers, neuroscientists, and legal scholars, highlighted that the stakes of the free will debate are not merely academic. They shape how we construct laws, design technologies, and understand human dignity. The cross-references to moral luck, the principle of alternative possibilities, and the Chinese room illustrate that the discussion is embedded in a broader network of ideas about mind, meaning, and morality. As we reflect on these contemporary debates, it is worth pausing to consider what each position ultimately offers us. Compatibilism provides a pragmatic framework that allows us to preserve moral responsibility in a world increasingly understood as causal and predictable. It offers a way to integrate scientific findings without abandoning our everyday practices of praise, blame, and justice. Libertarian incompatibilism, by insisting on genuine alternative possibilities and ultimate responsibility, protects the intuition that we are authors of our lives, and it safeguards the space for moral growth, creativity, and accountability that many find essential for human flourishing. Hard determinism, though stark, forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the limits of agency and invites us to rethink social practices, perhaps moving toward more compassionate, rehabilitative approaches that recognize the causal roots of behavior. The emergent perspectives from neuroscience and quantum mechanics do not settle the dispute, rather they enrich it. Brain-reading technologies expose the predictive power of the brain, challenging our sense of volition, while also offering tools for early intervention in mental health. Quantum indeterminacy invites libertarians to locate a foothold for freedom, but also reminds compatibilists that randomness alone does not grant agency. The consequence argument and manipulation argument continue to sharpen the philosophical tools we use to dissect these issues, ensuring that any claim to free will must grapple both with the deep causal chains that shape us and with the practical realities of influence and control. In closing, let us return to the image of the river we used earlier. Whether the water flows deterministically or is subject to occasional quantum eddies, the dam we build, our capacity to reflect, to revise, to endorse reasons, remains the locus of agency. Compatibilists see the dam as sufficient. Libertarians demand that the water retain the possibility of flowing a different course. Hard determinists argue that the dam is an illusion, a structure built on sand. The scientific advances of brain reading and quantum mechanics are the new engineers, probing the river's bed, testing the strength of the dam, and sometimes even reshaping the terrain. Our task as philosophers, scientists, and citizens is to keep asking, what does it mean to be responsible, to be moral, to be free, in a world where the currents are ever more visible? The answer may not be final, but the conversation, rich with anecdotes, analogies, and rigorous argument, continues to shape how we understand ourselves and each other. When we step back from the abstract arguments that have occupied philosophers for centuries, we find that the clash between determinism and free will is not merely a theoretical puzzle, but a living current that shapes the very texture of our moral lives, our legal institutions, and the quiet moments we spend with ourselves each day. Imagine a courtroom where a judge, after listening to a forensic neuroimaging report, decides that the defendant's brain chemistry tipped the scales toward compulsion rather than choice. Picture a person sitting in meditation, breathing in rhythm with the tide of thoughts, yet feeling an unexpected surge of responsibility for how those thoughts are directed. These scenes, though seemingly disparate, are bound together by a single question. What does it mean to act, and how should that meaning guide the structures we build around us? To begin, let us consider the shift in criminal sentencing that has emerged from a deterministic reading of human behavior. In the latter half of the 20th century, the prevailing model of punishment in many Western legal systems was retributive. A crime deserved a proportionate penalty, and the offender was treated as a rational agent who had freely chosen to transgress. Yet, as psychology, sociology, and neuroscience accumulated evidence that behavior is heavily conditioned by genetics, early trauma, and environmental pressures, a new narrative took hold. The deterministic perspective argues that many criminal acts are the inevitable outcomes of a complex web of causes beyond the individual's immediate control. This does not absolve responsibility, but it reframes it, suggesting that the purpose of sentencing should be to alter the causal conditions that produce the crime, rather than merely to exact vengeance. One concrete manifestation of this view is the rise of rehabilitative sentencing programs. Take, for example, the establishment of drug courts in the United States during the 1990s. Instead of sending non-violent drug offenders to prison, judges began ordering participants into structured treatment plans that addressed addiction as a disease, a deterministic condition rooted in neurochemical pathways and social marginalization. As Judge John C. Thomas remarked in a 1998 opinion, "We cannot punish what we do not understand. We must heal what we cannot wholly blame." The underlying philosophy echoes the deterministic insight that if an individual's actions are driven by compulsive neurobiological states, the most humane and effective response is to modify those states. The success rates of drug courts, often cited as reducing recidivism by up to 30% compared to traditional incarceration, provide empirical support for the argument that addressing the causes of behavior can lead to better outcomes for both the individual and society. A second, perhaps less obvious, application of deterministic thinking appears in the realm of restorative justice. In restorative circles, offenders are invited to confront the impact of their actions on victims and the community, while also reflecting on the personal histories that led them to offend. This process acknowledges that the offender's behavior did not arise in a vacuum, but was shaped by factors such as poverty, family dysfunction, or exposure to violence. By creating space for accountability within a context that recognizes causal influences, restorative justice attempts to transform deterministic insights into a constructive moral framework. As the philosopher Martha Nussbaum has written, justice must be attentive to the capacities and constraints that shape human agency, lest it become a cold instrument of retribution. The emphasis on capacity and constraint is a direct echo of deterministic thought, yet it does not surrender moral judgment. Rather, it seeks to cultivate conditions in which genuine agency can flourish. While the legal sphere has begun to incorporate deterministic perspectives, another domain, personal well-being, has turned to practices that integrate free will affirmation with deterministic acceptance. Mindfulness, a core component of Buddhist meditation, offers a vivid illustration. The Buddhist doctrine of anatta, or no self, teaches that the self is not a fixed, autonomous entity, but a flow of mental and physical processes arising from causes and conditions. In the words of the Buddha, all conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. At first glance, this seems to deny agency entirely. Yet contemporary mindfulness teachers, such as John Kabat-Zinn, argue that recognizing the conditioned nature of thoughts actually empowers us to choose how we relate to them. Kabat-Zinn often says, "You can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf." In practice, this means observing the deterministic currents of habit, craving, and automatic reaction, and then consciously steering attention toward more skillful responses. The result is a lived synthesis, an acceptance of the forces that shape us, coupled with an active cultivation of the moments where we can exercise choice. Consider the analogy of a river. A deterministic view tells us that the river's path is carved by the geology of the valley, the volume of water, and the climate over millennia. A free will perspective might urge us to imagine ourselves as a swimmer, capable of charting any course we wish. Mindfulness invites us to become both observer and participant. We acknowledge the river's flow, yet we learn to navigate its currents with intention, using the river's momentum rather than fighting against it. In everyday decision-making, this translates to recognizing that our preferences, moods, and even our values have been shaped by upbringing, culture, and neurobiology, while still affirming that we can pause, reflect, and choose actions that align with a deeper sense of purpose. The integration of these ideas does not proceed without tension. A strict deterministic stance can lead, if taken to its extreme, to moral nihilism, the belief that moral judgments are baseless because no one ever truly chooses. Imagine a courtroom where the judge declares, "Since the defendant's brain chemistry predetermined his actions, we cannot hold him morally accountable. Therefore, punishment is meaningless." This line of reasoning threatens to erode the very foundation of ethical discourse. As the 19th century philosopher G. Moore warned in his Principia Ethica, if we deny that agents can be held responsible, we also deny that moral statements have any meaning. The danger is that society could slide into a fatalistic complacency, where no one feels compelled to act justly because all actions are seen as the inevitable product of prior causes. Conversely, an unbridled affirmation of free will can breed its own form of passivity, a fatalistic resignation to the idea that everything is up to me, which can paradoxically lead individuals to blame themselves for circumstances beyond their control. This is the excessive agency critique often leveled at certain strains of neoliberal self-help culture. When people internalize the belief that they alone are responsible for success or failure, they may neglect the structural determinants, economic inequality, systemic racism, or health disparities that limit genuine choice. As the sociologist C. Wright Mills noted in The Sociological Imagination, the individual is not a mere atom of will. He is embedded in a network of social forces that shape his possibilities. The risk here is that the rhetoric of boundless freedom becomes a tool for moral judgment, casting those who struggle as morally deficient rather than victims of deterministic constraints. To illuminate these counterpoints, let us revisit two historical episodes that illustrate how the deterministic free will debate has played out in concrete settings. In the early 1970s, a series of landmark cases in the United States introduced the concept of battered women's syndrome into legal defenses. The pioneering case of State v. Kelly 1976 in Minnesota allowed a woman who had killed her abusive husband to argue that prolonged exposure to domestic violence had created a state of learned helplessness, a deterministic psychological condition that impaired her capacity for rational choice. The court's opinion, written by Judge John G. Klein, cited psychologist Lenore Walker's research, stating, "The victim's perception of danger is not a product of momentary fear, but of an entrenched pattern of coercive control that reshapes her volition." By recognizing the deterministic influence of sustained abuse, the legal system opened a pathway for more compassionate sentencing, often favoring treatment and protection over punitive measures. Yet critics warned that such defenses could be misused to excuse any violent act, potentially eroding personal accountability. The delicate balance struck in those cases continues to inform contemporary debates about how much weight we give to deterministic factors in assessing culpability. Fast forward to the 1990s, when the nascent field of neuro-law began to infiltrate courtroom practices. Pioneering scholars such as Dr. Michael Gazzaniga and Dr. Adrian Rain presented neuroimaging evidence suggesting that abnormalities in the prefrontal cortex or amygdala could predispose individuals to impulsivity, aggression, or psychopathy. In the 1995 case of United States v. Buchanan, the defense introduced a PET scan showing reduced activity in the defendant's orbitofrontal cortex, arguing that this impairment compromised his ability to foresee the consequences of his actions. The judge, acknowledging the emerging science, remarked, "If the mind is a machine and the machine is malfunctioning, we must consider repair before punishment." While the court ultimately upheld a conviction, the case sparked a vigorous debate about whether neuroscientific determinism should temper moral judgment. Critics like philosopher John Searle warned that the seductive allure of brain scans may lead us to a new form of biological determinism, where the law becomes a laboratory for neuroscience. The neuro-law movement thus exemplifies the tension between embracing scientific insights into causation and preserving a space for agency and moral responsibility. These two episodes, Battered Women's Syndrome and Neuro-Law, also reveal how deterministic insights can be harnessed to promote more humane policies. In the former, recognizing the deterministic impact of chronic abuse led to protective orders, shelters, and counseling programs designed to break the cycle of violence. In the latter, the awareness of neurodevelopmental risk factors has spurred early intervention initiatives, such as the Head Start programs that aim to enrich the environments of children in impoverished neighborhoods, thereby altering the deterministic trajectories that might otherwise lead to delinquency. Both cases illustrate a pragmatic synthesis. We can honor the reality of causal influences while still constructing frameworks that encourage growth, repair, and responsibility. Let us now turn to the ethical dimension. Virtue ethics, with its emphasis on character formation, offers a bridge between deterministic explanations and free will agency. Aristotle famously argued that virtues are habits cultivated through repeated action, shaped by upbringing and social context, clearly a deterministic view. Yet he also maintained that individuals have the capacity to choose virtuous actions, thereby exercising eudaimonia, or flourishing. In this light, the deterministic factors that shape a person's dispositions become the raw material for virtue development. As contemporary virtue ethicist Philippa Foot has observed, our moral life is a story of how we become the kind of person we are capable of being. The story unfolds within constraints, but the protagonist still wields a narrative agency that can steer the plot toward the good. Consequentialism, especially in its utilitarian form, also navigates this terrain. If outcomes are the primary moral yardstick, then understanding the deterministic causes of behavior becomes essential for predicting and maximizing beneficial consequences. A utilitarian policymaker, aware that punitive incarceration often fails to deter crime and may exacerbate recidivism, will favor rehabilitative measures that address underlying causes. John Stuart Mill, in his Utilitarianism, wrote, "The only proof that any object is desirable is that it produces happiness. To achieve happiness at a societal level, we must intervene in the deterministic chains that produce suffering." Yet consequentialism must guard against reducing individuals to mere instruments of outcome optimization, lest it slide into a deterministic calculus that neglects the intrinsic worth of agency. The Buddhist concept of anatta, or no self, adds another layer of nuance. By denying a permanent, independent self, Buddhism aligns with deterministic insights that the self is a flux of processes. However, Buddhist practice simultaneously cultivates mindfulness and ethical conduct, sila, suggesting that even in the absence of an enduring self, there is room for intentional action. The Dalai Lama has remarked, even though there is no permanent self, we can still act responsibly because our actions have consequences for the web of interdependence. This perspective resonates with modern compatibilist theories, which argue that freedom is not the absence of causation, but the ability to act according to one's desires and rational deliberations, even if those desires have causal histories. Bringing these philosophical threads together, we can outline a practical synthesis for everyday decision-making. First, acknowledge the deterministic forces at play, our genetic predispositions, the cultural narratives we internalize, the socioeconomic conditions that shape our opportunities. Second, cultivate a reflective stance through mindfulness, journaling, or dialogue that allows us to observe these forces without being wholly subsumed by them. Third, exercise agency by setting intentions that align with our values, recognizing that while the options we consider are conditioned, the act of choosing among them is a meaningful expression of self. Fourth, extend this personal practice into the social sphere. Advocate for policies that mitigate harmful deterministic influences, such as equitable education, mental health services, and restorative justice, while also supporting structures that empower individuals to make responsible choices. To illustrate how this might look in a concrete scenario, imagine a young adult named Maya who grew up in a neighborhood plagued by gang activity, limited school resources, and familial instability. Deterministic analysis would highlight the statistical correlation between such environments and higher rates of criminal involvement. Yet Maya, after attending a community meditation circle, discovers a practice that helps her notice the automatic urges to join a gang for protection. By observing these urges as conditioned responses, she is able to pause, consider alternative pathways, perhaps enrolling in a vocational training program, and ultimately choose a different direction. Her personal agency does not erase the structural challenges she faces, but it demonstrates how mindful awareness can create a space for choice within determinism. At the same time, policymakers, informed by deterministic research, allocate funding for after-school programs in Maya's community, thereby altering the causal landscape for future generations. The convergence of personal mindfulness and systemic reform exemplifies the harmonious blend of deterministic insight and free will affirmation. Another example comes from the corporate world. A multinational firm implements an employee wellness program that includes regular mindfulness sessions, stress reduction workshops, and training on implicit bias. The company's leadership recognizes, through organizational psychology studies, that employee behavior is heavily influenced by unconscious biases and stressors, deterministic factors that affect decision-making and ethical conduct. By providing tools that enhance self-awareness, the firm seeks to empower employees to act with greater intentionality, thereby reducing incidents of discrimination and improving overall performance. Here, deterministic knowledge informs the design of interventions that bolster agency, illustrating how the philosophical debate can translate into tangible organizational change. In both examples, we see the interplay of two countervailing risks. If we overemphasize determinism, we might tell Maya that her environment predestines her, leading to a self-fulfilling prophecy of resignation, a moral nihilism that denies the possibility of growth. If we overstate free will, we might blame Maya for failing to escape her circumstances, ignoring the structural barriers that limit her options, a fatalistic passivity that places the burden of success solely on individual effort. The ethical challenge, then, is to navigate a middle path that respects the causal realities of the world while preserving a space for meaningful agency. The philosophical literature offers several strategies for achieving this balance. Compatibilists such as Harry Frankfurt argue that freedom consists in acting according to one's second-order desires about desires, thereby allowing for a nuanced notion of responsibility even when first-order desires are causally determined. Frankfurt famously wrote, "A person is free when she is able to reflect upon her desires and endorse the ones that align with her deeper values." This view dovetails with mindfulness, which trains the mind to observe first-order impulses and cultivate second-order endorsement. Likewise, the existentialist perspective, championed by Jean-Paul Sartre, insists that we are condemned to be free, meaning that regardless of our determinants, we are always faced with the necessity to choose and thus bear responsibility. Sartre's claim, "man is nothing else but what he makes of himself," can be read not as a denial of causation, but as an invitation to assert meaning within the constraints we inherit. On the other side, hard determinists such as Baron de Halbach have warned that recognizing the totality of causation leads to the conclusion that moral praise and blame are illusory. De Halbach famously asserted, "We are nothing but machines. All our thoughts and actions are determined by the laws of nature." While this view underscores the importance of scientific understanding, it can also erode the motivational force behind ethical behavior if taken uncritically. To guard against this, many contemporary philosophers propose a pragmatic determinism that accepts causal explanations but retains normative language as a useful social tool. As philosopher Daniel Dennett puts it, even if free will is an illusion, the illusion is a useful one for guiding behavior and constructing societies. This pragmatic stance acknowledges that language of responsibility, praise, and blame serves to shape future behavior, even if the metaphysical foundation is contested. Returning to the legal arena, the modern trend towards sentencing reform illustrates how these philosophical positions can be operationalized. In many European jurisdictions, the concept of therapeutic jurisprudence has taken hold. This approach treats the law as a social force that can promote psychological well-being. Judges, informed by deterministic insights about mental illness, may order psychiatric treatment alongside or in place of incarceration. In the United Kingdom, the Mental Health Act allows for hospital orders, where offenders with diagnosed disorders receive compulsory treatment, reflecting the belief that addressing the underlying determinants of behavior serves both the individual and public safety. Yet the system still holds the individual accountable, requiring them to comply with treatment plans, a nod to the free will component. The balance is delicate. Too much emphasis on treatment could be perceived as excusing wrongdoing, while too little could ignore the rehabilitative potential of addressing root causes. Similarly, the United States has seen a growing movement toward evidence-based sentencing that incorporates risk assessment tools. These algorithms evaluate factors such as prior convictions, employment history, and even neuropsychological test scores to predict recidivism. Proponents argue that such tools embody deterministic knowledge, enabling more just and efficient allocation of resources. Critics, however, warn that reliance on statistical determinism can entrench systemic biases, effectively punishing individuals for characteristics they cannot control. The debate mirrors the broader philosophical tension. Can we ethically use deterministic predictions without stripping individuals of agency and dignity? The answer may lie in transparency and the preservation of judicial discretion, ensuring that statistical data informs but does not dictate outcomes. In the sphere of personal well-being, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, MBCT, provides a concrete illustration of how deterministic insights about brain plasticity can be combined with free will practices. Research shows that regular meditation can alter neural pathways associated with attention, emotion regulation, and self-referential processing. This neuroplastic change demonstrates that even though our brain structures are shaped by genetics and early experiences, they remain malleable and opening for agency. As neuroscientist Sarah Lazar noted, mindfulness meditation can increase the thickness of the prefrontal cortex, suggesting that intentional practice can reshape the very architecture that influences our choices. The therapeutic narrative thus becomes one of empowerment. We are not wholly bound by our neural determinism, but we can consciously engage in practices that reconfigure the deterministic landscape. To weave these threads into a cohesive synthesis, consider the following reflective question. If our actions are the product of both causal chains and deliberate choices, how should we live? One possible answer draws from the ancient Stoic maxim, live according to nature. Interpreted through a modern lens, this could mean aligning our actions with an understanding of the natural determinants that shape us while exercising our capacity to reflect and choose within that framework. It invites us to cultivate virtues, courage, justice, temperance that are resilient to deterministic pressures and to design institutions, legal, educational, health, that mitigate harmful causal influences. It also encourages personal practices, mindfulness, self-inquiry, that illuminate the hidden currents of desire and bias, granting us the clarity to steer our ships with intention. In closing, the dialogue between determinism and free will is not a binary contest, but a dynamic conversation that reverberates through ethics, law, and everyday life. The deterministic insights gleaned from psychology, sociology, and neuroscience compel us to redesign punitive systems, to invest in early intervention, and to recognize the profound impact of environment on behavior. The affirmation of free will, nurtured by mindfulness, virtue cultivation, and existential responsibility, reminds us that we are not merely passive vessels but active participants capable of shaping our destinies. The risk of moral nihilism looms when determinism is wielded as an excuse to abandon responsibility. The danger of fatalistic passivity arises when free will rhetoric becomes a weapon to blame individuals for circumstances beyond their control. By holding both perspectives in tension, we can construct a more compassionate, just, and flourishing society. As you reflect on these ideas, consider your own life. Where have you felt the weight of deterministic forces, perhaps a family history of addiction, a cultural expectation, a neurological tendency toward anxiety? Where have you experienced moments of genuine choice, where a pause and a breath allowed you to act differently than you might have otherwise? How might you apply the principles of rehabilitative justice to your community, perhaps by supporting mentorship programs or advocating for mental health services? How might you integrate mindfulness into your daily routine, not as a denial of responsibility, but as a tool to recognize the currents that shape you and to steer toward the values you hold dear? The philosophy of determinism versus free will invite us to sit at the intersection of science and meaning, to honor the facts of causation while also honoring the story we tell ourselves about who we are. In that space, ethics becomes a lived practice, law becomes a compassionate instrument, and everyday decision-making transforms from a random drift into a purposeful navigation. May this exploration inspire you to contemplate not only where you come from, but also where you are willing to go, and how you might help others chart their own courses amidst the ever-flowing river of cause and choice.